What if the most famous rumor about the British royal family was never really about DNA at all? What if it was about timing, about resentment, about how repetition can slowly turn a whisper into something people swear they've always known? And what if the real shock isn't who Prince Harry's father is, but how easily millions of people were convinced to doubt it? Let me ask you something right now. Be honest. When was the first time you heard the idea that Prince Harry might not be the biological son of King Charles III? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Was it a joke? A tabloid headline at the grocery store? A late-night TV punchline? A meme scrolling past too fast for you to question it? Most people can't even remember. And that's exactly how rumors like this survive. Because they don't arrive loudly. They arrive casually. A raised eyebrow. Some people say. A photo comparison with a red circle drawn around someone's hairline. And suddenly, a man's entire identity becomes a public debate. This story has resurfaced again. Hard. Louder than before. Fueled by viral videos, fake screenshots, AI-generated documents, and headlines screaming about a so-called DNA test that supposedly proves everything once and for all. Except no one can show it. No lab. No record. No confirmation. Just endless certainty. So tonight, we're not doing what the internet usually does. We're not repeating the rumor. We're not pretending speculation is evidence. We're not declaring shock truths in the thumbnail and walking it back quietly later. Instead, we're doing something much more uncomfortable. We're slowing down. We're tracing where this story came from, why it stuck, and what actually happens when a rumor is repeated so often that people stop asking if it was ever true in the first place. And by the end of this, you might realize something unsettling. The question, who is Prince Harry's real father, was answered decades ago. The real mystery is why so many people refuse to accept the answer. Let's rewind. Prince Harry was born into one of the most photographed families on Earth. From the moment he could walk, cameras followed. Every smile, every stumble, every awkward teenage phase frozen in high resolution. But unlike his older brother, comparisons followed him everywhere. He's different, they said. He looks different. He acts different. He feels different. And in royal families, different is dangerous. Hair color became evidence. Facial expressions became proof. Personality became suspicion. Have you ever noticed how quickly people move from "he doesn't look like him" to "he must not be his"? As if genetics works like a copy-paste function. As if millions of families don't include siblings who look nothing alike. But this wasn't just about looks. It was about narrative. Because during Prince Harry's childhood, his parents' marriage was already cracking under the weight of pressure, infidelity, and global scrutiny. And the world knew it. When Princess Diana later spoke openly about her unhappiness, the media didn't just report it. They fed on it. Every detail became content. Every confession became ammunition. And eventually, one name became inseparable from the gossip. James Hewitt. Say that name out loud, and you can feel the weight it carries. Not because of evidence, but because of repetition. People heard it once, then again, until was involved with Diana quietly morphed into must be Harry's father. But here's where the story already starts to crack. Because rumors don't care about calendars. Facts do. And the timeline has always been the rumor's biggest enemy. Yet somehow, it's the one thing almost no headline wants you to examine. Instead, they want you emotionally invested first. They want outrage before accuracy. They want you to feel like you're in on a secret the palace doesn't want you to know. Let me ask you another question. If there truly were a DNA test that definitively proved Prince Harry's biological father was not King Charles, don't you think it would be the most documented test in modern history? Not leaked through a blurry screenshot. Not confirmed by a source close to the situation. But published. Verified. Impossible to dispute. And yet, what do we actually have? We have claims of a test no one can access. We have experts who've never seen results. We have videos that cite other videos as proof. That's not evidence. That's an echo chamber. And the danger of echo chambers is that they don't need truth to survive. They just need engagement. Every time you click, every time you comment, every time you say, "I always thought this," the story grows stronger. Meanwhile, the human being at the center of it grows smaller. Imagine growing up knowing that strangers debate your parentage like it's a sport. Imagine watching people dissect your face and decide your identity for you. Imagine hearing jokes about who your real dad is while smiling for the cameras because that's what you were trained to do. Prince Harry didn't just inherit royal titles. He inherited a rumor that never let him breathe. And here's the part most people miss. This rumor didn't hurt the monarchy first. It hurt a child. And later, it hurt an adult who had to decide whether to laugh it off or let it destroy him. Some people say, if it weren't true, it wouldn't still be around. But history tells us the opposite. The longest-lasting rumors are often the least true because they survive on emotion, not facts. Think about it. This story gives people drama. It gives betrayal. It gives scandal. It gives the illusion of insider knowledge. And most importantly, it gives people permission to feel smarter than institutions they already distrust. But what if the story keeps coming back not because it's true, but because it's useful? Useful for tabloids. Useful for algorithms. Useful for anyone who benefits from tearing down symbols. And here's where things get even more uncomfortable. Because once a rumor becomes part of pop culture, disproving it feels like taking something away from people. It feels like ruining the fun. And some audiences don't want the truth. They want confirmation. So now, in 2026, the rumor returns with a new costume. DNA tests. Final proof. Case closed. Except, nothing has actually changed. No documents released. No statements issued. No confirmations from any credible authority. Just louder confidence. Which brings us to the most important question of all. Why now? Why does this story resurface every time Prince Harry speaks out, steps away, or challenges the system he was born into? Why does questioning his legitimacy feel so satisfying to certain audiences? And why does the internet seem more comfortable debating his biology than confronting its own appetite for destruction? Because once you really look at it, this isn't a story about fathers. It's a story about doubt. About how easily doubt can be planted. About how long it can survive. About how it can follow someone their entire life. And we're only at the beginning. Because next, we're going to do the one thing most viral videos refuse to do. We're going to slow the timeline down. We're going to look at dates. Real ones. We're going to examine when Diana actually met James Hewitt. When Prince Harry was actually conceived. And why this single detail quietly dismantles the entire rumor, if you're willing to face it. But once you see that, you'll understand why the internet never wants you to. Because what comes next doesn't just challenge a rumor. It challenges the way we consume stories altogether. And once you notice that, there's no unseeing it. What if one single date is enough to collapse an entire rumor? What if everything you've heard about Prince Harry's paternity only survives because almost no one ever slows down long enough to check a calendar? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The rumor only works if you never ask when. So let's ask it. Let's go back, not emotionally, not symbolically, but chronologically. Because time is ruthless. It doesn't care about drama. It doesn't bend for viral clips. And it has no patience for stories that sound good but don't line up. Prince Harry was born on September 15, 1984. That date is not disputed. That date is not controversial. That date has never changed. Now take a breath, because everything that follows hinges on something even more basic. Human biology. Pregnancy does not work backward from rumor. It works forward from conception, which means that for James Hewitt to be Prince Harry's biological father, he would have had to be involved with Princess Diana before the window in which Harry was conceived. Not after. Not around the same time. Not vaguely close. Before. And this is where the story begins to quietly unravel. James Hewitt did not meet Princess Diana until 1986. Let that sink in. 2 years after Prince Harry was born. Not 6 months. Not a few weeks. 2 full years. This is not speculation. This is documented. A matter of public record. A timeline that has been confirmed by biographers, journalists, and even by Hewitt himself. And yet, this fact almost never appears in the viral videos. Why? Because it ends the story before it starts. But let's not rush. Because the rumor didn't survive this long by being stupid. It survived by being slippery. Here's what happened instead. When Princess Diana later spoke openly about her relationship with James Hewitt, the media collapsed all context into one blurred idea. They removed sequence. They removed cause and effect. They removed time. They let audiences assume. And assumption is where misinformation thrives. Think about how the story is usually told online. They don't say, Diana met Hewitt years after Harry's birth. They say, Diana had an affair. They don't say, the relationship began in the mid to late 1980s. They say, around the same era. They don't say, there is no overlap with Harry's conception. They say, people have long suspected. Language matters. Because suspected sounds reasonable. Speculated sounds cautious. Questions remain sounds responsible. But none of those words change the math. And when the math doesn't work, the story has to rely on something else. That something else was appearance, hair color, face shape, mannerisms. And this is where the rumor picked up speed. Prince Harry has red hair. James Hewitt has red hair. King Charles does not. And suddenly, a genetic coincidence became a smoking gun. But here's the part no one likes to talk about. Red hair runs in Princess Diana's family. Her brother has red hair. Her sisters have red hair. Her ancestry includes the Spencer line, where red hair is common. In genetics, red hair is a recessive trait. That means it can appear even if neither parent visibly has it, as long as the gene is present. But explaining genetics isn't exciting. A side-by-side photo is. So the internet chose photos. Photos cropped just right. Photos taken years apart. Photos that ignore aging, lighting, weight, and expression. And slowly, the visual narrative overtook the factual one. Let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever looked at a child and thought they didn't resemble their parent, only to realize later they absolutely did? Of course you have. Families are full of surprises. Genetics reshuffles the deck every generation. But the rumor needed certainty. So it leaned harder into comparison. And the more it leaned, the more people forgot to ask the most basic question of all. If this were true, why would it still be a rumor? Why wouldn't it be a confirmed fact? Why would the most explosive revelation in modern royal history rely entirely on vibes and visuals? This is where the idea of a DNA test entered the story. Not from a laboratory, from the internet. At first, it was hypothetical. Surely they must have tested. There's no way they wouldn't know. I heard they did one privately. Then it became implied. Sources say the palace knows. Insiders claim it was settled years ago. And finally, it became declared. DNA test proves James Hewitt is Harry's father. But declared by whom? No medical authority. No legal document. No verified statement. Just repetition. And repetition is powerful. Because once people hear something enough times, their brains stop tagging it as unverified. It starts to feel familiar. And familiarity feels like truth. This is why misinformation is so dangerous. It doesn't scream. It hums. It becomes background noise. And over time, people stop remembering where they heard it. They just remember that they heard it. So when a new video pops up claiming final proof, it feels like confirmation rather than invention. But let's go back to the people involved. Princess Diana was not subtle about her life. When she chose to speak, she spoke openly, painfully, honestly. She admitted to affairs. She discussed emotional isolation. She did not protect the monarchy with silence. And yet, even she never claimed Prince Harry's father was anyone other than King Charles. Not once. Not in private conversations that later surfaced. Not in interviews. Not in writings. If there had been doubt, this would have been the moment it emerged. Instead, it didn't. And James Hewitt himself has addressed the rumor directly. He has denied it. Not with hedging. Not with ambiguity. He has stated plainly that he did not meet Diana until after Harry was born. And yet, people dismiss this. Why? Because once a rumor is emotionally satisfying, denials feel suspicious. People don't ask, is this true? They ask, why would they lie? But what if no one needs to lie when the truth is already mundane? What if the reason this story never delivers proof is because there is none? That's not dramatic, but it is revealing, because it forces us to confront something else entirely. Why do so many people want this to be true? Why does the idea of Prince Harry being illegitimate feel appealing to certain audiences? Because it reframes his entire life. It turns a royal rebel into an outsider. It turns conflict into destiny. It turns personal struggle into narrative symmetry. And narratives are addictive, especially ones that punish institutions people already resent. The monarchy represents privilege, tradition, and power. So the idea that one of its most famous members doesn't truly belong feels like poetic justice to some. But poetic justice isn't evidence. And here's the cruel part. Prince Harry has spent his entire life navigating identity under scrutiny, not just as a royal, but as a person. Every mistake magnified, every emotion analyzed, every choice questioned, and layered on top of that, a rumor that suggests he doesn't even know who he is, that his very origin is up for debate. Imagine living like that. Imagine knowing that no matter what you achieve, people will always reduce you to a theory, a what if, a punchline. And then imagine watching the internet resurrect that theory every few years, louder than before, pretending it's new. This isn't harmless gossip. It's identity erosion. And the most disturbing part is how normalized it has become. People will say, it's just curiosity, or we're just asking questions. But questions asked in bad faith are accusations in disguise. Because no one asks this about people without power. No one debates the parentage of private citizens for entertainment. This happens because Prince Harry is famous, and because the internet feels entitled to his story. But entitlement doesn't equal truth. And now that you've seen the timeline, now that you've seen how the dates don't align, now that you've seen how the rumor survives by skipping the boring parts, you might be wondering something else. If the facts have always been available, why didn't they stop the rumor sooner? Why didn't this end decades ago? And that question opens a much darker door. Because next, we're going to look at how media incentives, algorithms, and outrage culture quietly keep stories like this alive long after they've been disproven. And once you understand that system, you'll realize this rumor was never really about Prince Harry at all. It was about what keeps us clicking. And what comes next will make you question every shocking revelation you've ever scrolled past without stopping to ask who profits from it. But that part of the story, that's where things get uncomfortable. And we're just getting started. Who profits when a rumor refuses to die? That's the question most people never ask. And it's the question that turns this story from a curiosity into something much darker. Because by now, you've seen it. The timeline doesn't work. The dates don't overlap. The people involved have denied it. The supposed DNA test doesn't exist in any verifiable form. And yet the story keeps coming back. So if it's not surviving on evidence, what is it surviving on? Attention. Let's talk about how attention is monetized. Modern media doesn't reward accuracy. It rewards reaction. It rewards shock, outrage, disbelief, and the kind of emotional jolt that makes you stop scrolling and say, wait, what? A headline that says, timeline confirms rumor is false, dies instantly. A headline that says, DNA test finally reveals the truth, explodes. It doesn't matter if the claim collapses in the second paragraph. By then, the click already happened. The ad already loaded. The video already counted as a view. Truth is quiet. Sensation is loud. And this particular rumor is sensational in a very specific way. It doesn't just accuse. It destabilizes. It suggests that one of the most recognizable institutions in the world is built on a lie. That a man's identity is fraudulent. That the public has been fooled. And nothing fuels engagement like the idea that you know something others don't. Let me ask you something. How many times have you seen a video where the creator says, "The palace doesn't want you to know this"? That phrase alone is designed to bypass skepticism. It positions doubt as courage and belief as gullibility. If you question the claim, you're naive. If you accept it, you're enlightened. That's not journalism. That's manipulation. And here's where algorithms step in. Platforms don't understand truth. They understand behavior. They measure how long you watch, how often you comment, how quickly you share. If a rumor makes people argue, it spreads further. If it makes people angry, it spreads faster. If it touches something emotional, it spreads the fastest of all. Prince Harry's identity touches emotion. It touches family. It touches betrayal. It touches the idea of belonging. So the algorithm keeps feeding it. Not because it's accurate, but because it works. And every time it resurfaces, it comes back stronger, more confident, more absolute. At first, it was some people think. Then it was many believe. Then it became it's widely known. Language evolves. Certainty grows. But notice what never grows alongside it. Evidence. Instead, creators rely on implication. They'll show a photo of James Hewitt next to Prince Harry and pause dramatically. They'll show a clip of Princess Diana speaking and cut it mid-sentence. They'll flash the words DNA test on screen without explaining where the information came from. And most viewers won't notice what's missing. Because the delivery feels authoritative. Music swells. Graphics shake. The narrator lowers their voice. It feels like revelation. But revelation without verification is just performance. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. This rumor didn't. They'll show a photo of James Hewitt next to Prince Harry and pause dramatically. They'll show a clip of Princess Diana speaking and cut it mid-sentence. They'll flash the words DNA test on screen without explaining where the information came from. And most viewers won't notice what's missing because the delivery feels authoritative. Music swells. Graphics shake. The narrator lowers their voice. It feels like revelation. But revelation without verification is just performance. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. This rumor didn't just happen to Prince Harry. It was done to him. Repeatedly. For decades. While he was a child. While he was a teenager. While he was grieving his mother. While he was serving in the military. While he was trying to define himself outside the royal machine. Imagine trying to figure out who you are while the world debates whether you even belong where you were born. That kind of pressure doesn't disappear just because someone smiles in public. And Prince Harry has spoken about feeling like the spare, the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit. Now ask yourself something honestly. Do you think growing up under a rumor questioning your parentage might contribute to that feeling? Do you think it might shape how you see authority, family, loyalty? Do you think it might make you suspicious of institutions that let the rumor circulate unchecked? Because here's another uncomfortable truth. The palace didn't aggressively shut this rumor down. Not because it was true, but because responding to every tabloid lie gives it oxygen. And yet, silence can look like secrecy. So the vacuum filled itself. Speculation rushed in where clarity didn't. And the longer it lingered, the harder it became to erase. This is how misinformation wins. Not by overpowering facts, but by outlasting them. And here's where the story gets even more twisted. The rumor didn't just survive criticism. It adapted. When timelines were exposed, it shifted to DNA. When DNA couldn't be shown, it shifted to cover-ups. When cover-ups sounded implausible, it shifted to you can see it in his face. Every time one angle failed, another took its place. Because the goal was never resolution. The goal was continuation. A story that ends stops earning. A mystery that never resolves keeps paying. And the internet is full of people willing to sell certainty without responsibility. But let's pause for a moment. Because while this rumor has been recycled endlessly, there's one thing it consistently avoids. Prince Harry himself. Not caricature Harry. Not tabloid Harry. The actual person. The man who grew up with cameras watching his grief. The man who walked behind his mother's coffin while the world watched. The man who has spoken openly about mental health, trauma, and identity. Why doesn't the rumor ever grapple with him as a human being? Because doing so makes it harder to treat his life like a puzzle. It's easier to speculate about genetics than to confront pain. It's easier to question legitimacy than to question how we consume suffering as entertainment. And that brings us to the most revealing contradiction of all. The same people who claim to care about truth are often the ones spreading the least verified version of it. They'll say, "I'm just asking questions." But questions without standards aren't curiosity. They're camouflage. Because real curiosity accepts answers. This rumor doesn't. It rejects answers that don't fit the narrative. And the narrative it wants is simple. Prince Harry doesn't belong. Prince Harry was never meant to be there. Prince Harry's difference is proof. But difference doesn't mean deception. And family doesn't reduce itself to blood tests. Which leads us to something even deeper. What if the obsession with Prince Harry's paternity says more about us than it does about him? What if this story persists because it satisfies a cultural hunger to tear down figures who challenge tradition? What if doubting his legitimacy makes it easier to dismiss his voice? Because if he doesn't belong, then maybe he doesn't get to speak. Maybe his criticism doesn't count. Maybe his pain is exaggerated. Maybe his perspective is invalid. And suddenly, a rumor becomes a tool. A way to undermine without engaging. A way to discredit without debating. That's not harmless gossip. That's power. And power doesn't operate accidentally. So now we're left with a question far bigger than hair color or DNA tests. Why does the idea of Prince Harry being an outsider feel so necessary to so many people? Why does it provoke satisfaction? Why does it keep coming back precisely when he asserts independence? Because the next part of this story isn't about tabloids or timelines. It's about identity, about what happens when a person refuses to play the role assigned to them, about what institutions do when someone steps outside the script, and about how the easiest way to silence a voice is to question whether it ever had the right to speak. That's where we're going next. Because once you start looking at this rumor through that lens, everything changes. And what you're about to realize next will make you see every headline, every shocking revelation, and every so-called exposé very differently. But that realization, it comes at a cost. And once you see it, there's no going back. What happens when a person stops playing the role everyone expects them to play? Because this is where the story shifts. Quietly at first, then all at once. Up until now, the rumor functioned as background noise. A running joke. A tabloid punchline. Something people repeated without fully interrogating. But the moment Prince Harry began to step outside the boundaries of what the institution expected of him, the rumor stopped being casual. It became useful. Ask yourself this. Why did the volume turn up when he spoke about trauma? Why did it spike when he challenged the press? Why did it roar back when he distanced himself from royal duties? Because at that point, the rumor wasn't just gossip anymore. It was leverage. When someone breaks away from a system, the system looks for ways to explain why. And the easiest explanation is not courage or conviction or pain. It's illegitimacy. If he doesn't belong, then his rebellion isn't meaningful. If he was never truly one of them, then his criticism doesn't sting. If he's an outsider by blood, then he's always been an outsider by nature. Do you see how neat that is? It transforms a complicated human story into a simple moral. And simple morals spread faster than complex truths. This is why identity matters so much in this narrative. Not just biological identity, but symbolic identity. Prince Harry wasn't just a son. He was a spare, a backup, a supporting character in a rigid hierarchy that values order over individuality. And when that supporting character steps forward and says, "This system harmed me," the system doesn't want to hear it. So instead of responding to the substance of what he's saying, attention shifts to something else. Where he came from, whether he belongs, whether he's legitimate enough to speak. It's a classic move. Discredit the messenger so you don't have to engage with the message. And this is where the rumor gains a second life. Not as a question about DNA, but as a question about authority. Who gets to speak for the monarchy? Who gets to criticize it? Who gets to redefine themselves outside it? If Prince Harry is framed as someone who never truly belonged, then his voice can be dismissed as bitterness rather than experience. And that framing doesn't require proof. It only requires repetition. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Have you noticed how often people say, "He was always different," as if that difference explains everything? Different temperament, different priorities, different reactions to pressure. But difference isn't evidence of deception. It's evidence of humanity. Yet the rumor rebrands difference as suspicion. And once that rebranding takes hold, everything he does is reinterpreted through that lens. His emotional openness becomes instability. His vulnerability becomes weakness. His defiance becomes proof that he never belonged. And suddenly, the rumor doesn't need to be proven. It just needs to feel right. This is how narratives replace facts. And here's where the contradiction gets sharper. The same people who insist that the monarchy is cold, distant, and emotionally repressive will turn around and punish the one member who openly says, "That environment hurt me." They'll say, "That's just who you are." They'll say, "You're too sensitive." They'll say, "You were never cut out for it." And then, almost casually, they'll float the idea that maybe he was never truly part of it to begin with. As if that would explain everything. But let's slow this down again. Because once you strip away the narrative convenience, you're left with something simpler and far less sensational. Prince Harry grew up in an environment that prized duty over emotion. He lost his mother in the most public way imaginable. He was expected to grieve in silence, on schedule, under cameras. He spent his formative years under scrutiny that most people could not survive. And when he later questioned that environment, people didn't want to ask whether the system failed him. They wanted to ask whether he was defective, or worse, illegitimate. This is not about biology. It's about belonging. And the obsession with his parentage reveals a cultural discomfort with people who refuse to stay in their assigned roles, especially when those people were born into power. Because if a royal can say, "This hurt me," then what does that mean for everyone else? If someone with privilege can still be damaged by a system, then the system itself becomes the problem. And that's a much harder conversation to have. So instead, attention drifts back to the rumor, back to hair color, back to old photos, back to supposed DNA tests that never surface. It's safer there. It keeps the focus on the individual instead of the structure. And now, after years of repetition, the rumor has evolved again. It's no longer presented as speculation. It's presented as inevitability. You can't tell me you don't see it. It's obvious. Everyone knows. These phrases are powerful because they shut down debate. They imply that disagreement is ignorance. But obviousness is not proof. It's consensus masquerading as certainty. And consensus can be manufactured. All it takes is enough voices saying the same thing long enough. This is why the rumor has survived every factual rebuttal. Because it doesn't exist to be tested. It exists to be believed. And belief doesn't require evidence. It requires alignment with emotion, anger at institutions, frustration with elites, resentment of privilege. The rumor slots neatly into all of it. It says, see, even they are fake. But here's where things get even more revealing. Despite decades of rumor, no legal challenge has ever emerged. No succession crisis was triggered. No constitutional alarm was raised. Because at the level where truth actually matters, the story doesn't exist. It only lives where outrage lives. Online, in tabloids, in comment sections. And yet, those spaces shape perception. They shape how people talk about Prince Harry. They shape how his motives are interpreted. They shape whether his pain is seen as legitimate or theatrical. And that has real consequences. Because once someone's identity is constantly questioned, everything they say becomes suspect. Not because of what they say, but because of who people think they are. And now, the rumor has become a shorthand. A way to dismiss complexity with a smirk. A way to avoid empathy. A way to say, this isn't our problem. But here's the part that should give you pause. If this rumor were truly about truth, it would have ended long ago. Truth has a way of settling. But this story doesn't want to settle. It wants to circulate. And circulation requires fuel. That fuel is outrage, curiosity, and the illusion of forbidden knowledge. Which brings us to the most dangerous phase of the rumor yet. The phase where people stop asking if it's true and start asking why it's being hidden. Because once you believe something is being hidden, the absence of evidence becomes evidence itself. No proof. That's because it was covered up. No confirmation. That's because powerful people intervened. This is the point where logic collapses completely. Because now, nothing can disprove the claim. And that's when a rumor becomes an article of faith. But faith-based beliefs don't respond to facts. They respond to identity. And the identity being reinforced here is simple. Us versus them. Outsiders versus insiders. Truth-tellers versus liars. Prince Harry becomes a symbol instead of a person. And symbols don't get the benefit of nuance. They get used. So now, as this story continues to resurface, louder and more confident each time, the real question isn't whether the rumor is true. The real question is why we keep needing it. Why does it feel satisfying to imagine that someone who challenged the system was never truly part of it? Why does it feel comforting to believe that dissent comes from illegitimacy rather than conviction? And why does the idea of a DNA test revelation keep grabbing attention even when no such revelation exists? Because it promises finality. It promises closure. It promises to simplify a complicated human story into a single twist. But real life doesn't work that way. Identity is not a reveal at the end of a video. Belonging is not determined by headlines. And truth is not louder just because it's repeated. And now, having seen how the rumor functions, how it adapts, how it's weaponized, we're left with something unavoidable. The cost. The cost of turning a person's origin into entertainment. The cost of treating identity as a puzzle to be solved rather than a life to be lived. And next, we're going to confront that cost directly. Because the most overlooked part of this entire story isn't the monarchy, or the media, or the internet. It's the human impact. What it does to someone to have their existence questioned for decades. what it does to grow up knowing that strangers feel entitled to decide who you are. And once you sit with that, the rumor doesn't feel clever anymore. It feels cruel. And what comes next will force us to reckon with that cruelty in a way most people have never considered. But be warned. This is the part of the story that's hardest to shrug off. Because once you see it, laughing it off becomes impossible. What does it do to a person when the world keeps questioning whether they're real? Not metaphorically real, not symbolically real, but real in the most fundamental sense, where you come from, who you belong to, and whether your story is even yours to tell. Because this is the part almost no one talks about. We've dissected the rumor. We've followed the timeline. We've exposed how media, algorithms, and incentives keep it alive. But all of that still keeps the story at a distance. Now we have to step closer. Now we have to ask what happens to the human being who lives inside this rumor. Imagine growing up knowing that your name doesn't belong to you alone, that it's owned by newspapers, by commentators, by strangers who feel entitled to rewrite your life based on what entertains them most. Prince Harry didn't just inherit a title. He inherited a narrative that he never consented to. And from an early age, that narrative whispered something corrosive. You are not quite legitimate. You are not quite enough. You are not quite one of us. Even if no one said it directly, the message was there. In jokes, in headlines, in smirks. Children absorb subtext long before they understand politics. They notice tone. They feel difference. They internalize judgment. And when that judgment follows you everywhere, it doesn't stay external. It becomes a mirror. Ask yourself this. How would you grow up if people constantly suggested you didn't belong in your own family? If teachers, peers, comedians, and commentators all treated a question about your origin as fair game? You might laugh it off. You might joke about it. You might pretend it doesn't hurt. But pretending doesn't erase impact. It just delays it. And delay has a cost. Prince Harry has spoken about feeling like the outsider, the spare, the one who didn't quite fit the mold. That feeling didn't come from nowhere. It was reinforced. Every comparison to his brother, every headline highlighting difference, every recycled rumor about his parentage. The world kept telling him, you're not like the others. And eventually, a person starts to ask why. Not in public, not loudly, but privately. Am I different because I'm weaker? Or because I'm not meant to be here? That's the quiet danger of this rumor. It doesn't just accuse. It destabilizes. It creates an identity fracture. And identity fractures don't heal easily. Now, some people will say, he's privileged. He should be fine. But privilege doesn't make you immune to psychological erosion. In some ways, it intensifies it. Because when you're expected to be composed, grateful, and silent, there's no room to fall apart. There's no room to say, this hurts. There's no room to ask for understanding. Instead, you're told to toughen up. And when you don't, your vulnerability becomes another mark against you. See how the logic turns. If you're struggling, it's because you're weak. If you're emotional, it's because you're unstable. If you're different, it's because you never belonged. The rumor becomes a shortcut explanation for complexity. And that's seductive. It lets people avoid empathy. Because empathy requires effort. It requires sitting with discomfort. It requires acknowledging harm. It requires seeing someone as fully human. A rumor doesn't require any of that. A rumor flattens a person into a talking point. And Prince Harry has been flattened over and over again. But here's something most people miss. The rumor didn't just affect how the public saw him. It affected how the institution around him treated him too. Because once a person is perceived as different, expectations change. They're watched more closely. Their mistakes are magnified. Their emotions are policed. And when they react, the reaction becomes the story, not the cause. This is where the cycle tightens. Rumor creates distance. Distance creates misunderstanding. Misunderstanding creates conflict. Conflict then confirms the rumor. See how neat that is? No proof required. And over time, the person at the center starts to internalize the role they're being cast in. Not consciously, but behavior adapts. You pull away. You become defensive. You question loyalty. And then people say, see? He was always like this. But was he? Or was he responding to years of subtle exclusion? This is why the obsession with his parentage is not just tasteless. It's destabilizing. It robs a person of narrative agency. It says, we get to decide who you are. And that's a form of control. Now, let's talk about the moment everything shifted. The moment Prince Harry stopped absorbing the narrative and started pushing back. The moment he began to speak openly about mental health, trauma, and the damage done by relentless scrutiny. For some people, this was brave. For others, it was unforgivable. Because speaking breaks the spell. It forces listeners to confront the consequences of their curiosity. It makes the cost visible. And not everyone wants to see that. So instead of engaging with, it looks selfish. It looks suspicious. And the rumor slots neatly into that perception. It says, of course he left. He never truly belonged. And the circle closes. But here's the part that should make you pause. Despite all of this, despite decades of speculation, despite endless headlines and recycled theories, one thing has never changed. Prince Harry has never questioned who his father is. He has never claimed confusion. He has never suggested doubt. He has never sought public clarification. That silence is not ignorance. It's certainty. People who don't know tend to ask. People who are unsure tend to search. People who are confused tend to speak. His silence is not mysterious. It's grounded. And that tells you something. But the internet doesn't like grounded stories. They don't perform well. They don't spark outrage. They don't generate clicks. So the rumor persists. Not because it's unresolved, but because it's profitable. And now, having confronted the human cost, having seen how deeply this narrative cuts, we're left with one final layer to examine. Responsibility. Who is responsible for keeping this alive? Is it the tabloids? The creators? The platforms? Or is it the audience? Because every rumor needs an echo. And without participation, it dies. Next, we're going to look directly at that participation, at how ordinary viewers become part of the machinery without realizing it, at how sharing, commenting, and just asking questions fuel something far more damaging than it seems. And once you see that role clearly, you'll never consume stories like this the same way again. Because the most uncomfortable truth of all is this. The rumor doesn't survive because of power. It survives because of us. And that realization? That's where the story turns inward. And what comes next may be the hardest part to accept. What role do we play in this? That's the question no one likes to ask, because it removes the comfort of distance. It means this story isn't just about tabloids or algorithms or faceless institutions. It means it passes through ordinary hands, through taps, clicks, shares, comments, and reactions. Through us. Because rumors don't spread themselves. They move because someone decides a headline is worth forwarding. Because a clip feels too shocking not to repost. Because a comment section feels like a place to add one more joke, one more, "I always thought so," one more raised eyebrow. And none of those actions feel serious on their own. That's the danger. Each individual action feels insignificant. But together, they create momentum. And momentum creates permanence. Think about how this usually works. You're scrolling. You see a video claiming DNA test finally reveals the truth. You might not even fully believe it, but it's intriguing. So you watch a few seconds. Maybe you read the comments. Maybe you like one because it aligns with something you've heard before. You don't verify. You don't pause. You don't ask where the information came from. You move on. But the platform doesn't. It registers your engagement. It learns that this kind of content holds attention, and it serves it to more people. Suddenly, the rumor isn't just alive. It's optimized. And now ask yourself something honestly. How often do you see a correction go as viral as the original claim? Almost never. Because outrage travels faster than retraction. Certainty travels faster than nuance. A bold lie travels faster than a careful truth. And this rumor thrives in that environment. It's neat. It's provocative. It offers a twist. It doesn't ask you to think. It asks you to react. And reaction feels good. It feels like participation. It feels like agency. But participation without responsibility turns into complicity. Now, some people will say, it's just a rumor. It's not that deep. But let's be honest. If it weren't deep, it wouldn't keep coming back. If it weren't powerful, it wouldn't still be circulating decades later. If it didn't have impact, it wouldn't still provoke such strong reactions. We minimize it because acknowledging its weight makes us uncomfortable. Because it means admitting that entertainment can harm. That curiosity can cross into cruelty. That our consumption habits have consequences. And here's the uncomfortable part. This rumor didn't survive because people were malicious. It survived because people were indifferent. Because it was easier to laugh than to question, easier to assume than to investigate, easier to say everyone knows than to ask, how do we know? Indifference is fertile ground for misinformation. It doesn't need belief. It just needs apathy. And over time, apathy hardens into acceptance. People stop asking whether the claim is true. They start asking why it's being hidden. That's the tipping point. Because once a rumor enters the territory of they don't want you to know, logic stops working. Every absence of evidence becomes proof of suppression. Every denial becomes confirmation of guilt. Every silence becomes suspicious. This is how conspiracy thinking feeds itself. And the internet is exceptionally good at amplifying that loop. Now think about what this does to discourse. Instead of debating ideas, people debate identities. Instead of engaging with arguments, people question legitimacy. Instead of addressing harm, people redirect attention. The rumor becomes a way to avoid accountability. If Prince Harry's criticism of the press is dismissed as bitterness, no one has to examine press behavior. If his comments about trauma are dismissed as weakness, no one has to examine institutional neglect. If his independence is dismissed as entitlement, no one has to examine rigidity. The rumor does that work quietly, efficiently, and every time it's shared, that work continues. Now let's talk about something even more subtle. The pleasure of knowing. There is a certain satisfaction in believing you possess hidden truth. It makes you feel perceptive, savvy, less naive than others. That feeling is addictive, and stories like this feed it perfectly. They invite you into an imagined inner circle. They flatter your skepticism. They reward distrust. But real skepticism asks for evidence. What this rewards is suspicion, and suspicion without standards becomes paranoia. This is why the rumor doesn't die when it's disproven. Disproof threatens identity. If someone has built part of their worldview around believing this story, letting it go feels like losing something. Not just information, but status. It means admitting you were misled. It means reevaluating other things you've accepted without scrutiny. It means acknowledging that you might have contributed to harm. That's a hard pill to swallow. So instead, the mind doubles down. Well, maybe the dates are wrong. Well, maybe it was covered up. Well, you can't trust official records anyway. And suddenly, the burden of proof flips. The person making the claim no longer has to prove it. Everyone else has to disprove it to an impossible standard. This is how rumors become unkillable. And this is where responsibility becomes unavoidable. Because once you understand this mechanism, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often the most extreme version of a story gets the most attention. How often nuance is mocked as weakness. How often complexity is treated as deception. And you start realizing that every click is a vote. Not a moral vote. A structural one. It tells platforms what to amplify. It tells creators what to produce. It tells media outlets what pays. So when a rumor like this resurfaces again and again, it's not because people keep discovering something new. It's because the system keeps being rewarded for serving it. And that means change doesn't start with a headline. It starts with behavior. With pausing instead of sharing. With questioning instead of reacting. With asking who benefits, instead of what if. Now, here's where this gets even more uncomfortable. Because responsibility doesn't just belong to anonymous users. It belongs to creators. To commentators who dress speculation up as investigation. To channels that use authoritative language without authoritative sourcing. To videos that promise revelation but deliver implication. There is a difference between examining a rumor and exploiting it. Examination involves context, timelines, and verification. Exploitation involves thumbnails, certainty, and omission. And many creators know exactly where that line is. They cross it anyway, because outrage pays better than restraint, and the audience rarely punishes them for it. In fact, the audience often rewards it. With views, with likes, with comments that say, "Finally, someone said it." But saying something loudly does not make it true. It just makes it visible. And visibility is not truth's ally in the attention economy. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. This rumor has been circulating for decades. It has been debunked repeatedly. It has been denied by the people involved. It has no credible evidence supporting it. And yet, it continues to shape how a real person is perceived. That should give us pause. Because if this can happen to someone this visible, this documented, this scrutinized, what happens to people without that visibility? What happens when rumors circulate about private individuals with no platform to counter them? The stakes are even higher, which means the way we handle stories like this matters beyond this one case. It sets precedent. It teaches platforms what we tolerate. It teaches creators what we reward. It teaches society how casually we treat truth. And now we're at the final turning point of this story. Because once you recognize the mechanics, the next step is unavoidable. Reframing. This isn't a story about a DNA test. It isn't a story about hair color. It isn't even a story about monarchy. It's a story about how easily we confuse repetition with reality. About how stories gain power not through accuracy, but through circulation. About how questioning someone's identity becomes entertainment when empathy is removed. And here's the most sobering realization of all. The rumor doesn't need to be believed by everyone to survive. It only needs enough people to keep it alive. Enough people to share it ironically. Enough people to repeat it skeptically. Enough people to say, I don't know, but those half-beliefs are its oxygen. And once you see that, you realize something else. Ending a rumor doesn't require proving it false again and again. It requires refusing to participate, refusing to amplify, refusing to normalize, refusing to treat speculation as harmless fun. That's not censorship. That's discernment. And discernment is something the attention economy quietly discourages. Because it slows things down. It asks you to think. It interrupts the dopamine loop. And that's why it's rare. But it's also why it matters. Now, as we move into the final stretch of this story, there's one last piece to confront. Not about rumor. Not about media. Not about platforms. About closure. Because many people keep chasing this story because they want an ending. A final reveal. A moment where everything clicks into place. But some stories don't resolve the way we want them to. Some don't end with a twist. Some end with a realization. And the realization here is simple, but heavy. The truth about Prince Harry's parentage has been stable for decades. What hasn't been stable is our relationship with truth itself. And that's what we need to sit with next. Because the final question isn't, who is his father? The final question is what kind of audience we choose to be. And once we face that question honestly, this story stops being about him at all. It becomes about us. And that's where the real reckoning begins. So what does closure actually look like when a story was never broken to begin with? That's the uncomfortable ending no one prepares you for. Because the internet loves finales. It loves reveals. It loves moments where the curtain pulls back and everything suddenly makes sense. A gasp, a twist, a headline that promises finality. But this story was never built for that kind of ending. It was built to loop. And loops don't resolve. They repeat until someone chooses to step out of them. That's why people keep waiting for the moment, the leaked document, the confession, the DNA test that ends all debate. They're waiting for something external to settle what was always internal. Doubt. And doubt feels active. It feels investigative. It feels intelligent. But here's the quiet truth. Doubt without evidence is an inquiry. It's habit. And habits don't end with revelations. They end with decisions. At some point, every audience has to decide whether they want answers or entertainment. Because if answers were the goal, this story would have stopped decades ago. The timeline has been clear. The denials have been consistent. The evidence has never materialized. And yet, none of that satisfied the appetite. Why? Because appetite wasn't for truth. It was for narrative. The narrative of the outsider. The narrative of the illegitimate heir. The narrative that says, see? Even the most powerful families are built on lies. That narrative scratches something deep in the culture. It comforts cynicism. It rewards suspicion. It flatters disbelief. And letting it go means giving up that comfort. It means accepting that sometimes the boring explanation is the right one. That sometimes a family is exactly what it appears to be, even if it's dysfunctional, even if it's flawed, even if it disappoints us. And that's not satisfying to everyone. Because a satisfying story is not the same thing as a true one. Now think about how often this pattern appears elsewhere. Celebrities accused without evidence. Public figures reduced to conspiracies. Complex lives flattened into single theories. Once you notice it here, you start seeing it everywhere. A rumor emerges. It spreads because it's provocative. It survives because it's profitable. It hardens because people repeat it. And eventually, it becomes part of cultural background noise. At that point, correcting it feels awkward. Like interrupting a joke everyone else is laughing at. And nobody wants to be the person who says, actually. So the rumor continues. Not because it's convincing, but because it's convenient. Convenient for creators who need content. Convenient for platforms that need engagement. Convenient for audiences who want simple explanations for complicated people. And this is where closure gets redefined. Closure doesn't come from a final piece of proof. It comes from recognizing that the question itself was misplaced. The question was never, who is Prince Harry's biological father? That answer has never changed. The real question was, why are we so invested in questioning it? Why does this story keep pulling people back in, even after it's been examined from every angle? Why does it feel unfinished, even though nothing is unresolved? Because unresolved facts aren't the problem. Unresolved feelings are. There's frustration with institutions, anger at inequality, disillusionment with power, and this rumor became a vessel for all of that. It allowed people to express distrust without confronting its sources. It allowed critique without accountability. It allowed entertainment without empathy. And once you understand that, something shifts. You stop waiting for the internet to deliver closure. You realize closure is something you choose. You choose whether to keep clicking. You choose whether to keep sharing. You choose whether to keep framing someone's identity as a mystery for consumption. And that choice matters. Because stories don't just reflect culture. They shape it. They teach us what's acceptable to question. They teach us whose pain is negotiable. They teach us when curiosity becomes cruelty. And for years, this story taught a quiet lesson. That it was acceptable to doubt someone's origin publicly. That it was fine to joke about it. That it was harmless speculation. Until you look at the cost. The cost of decades of insinuation. The cost of having one's legitimacy debated like trivia. The cost of being reduced to a rumor instead of recognized as a person. When you add those costs up, the entertainment value collapses. It stops being clever. It stops being edgy. It just feels unnecessary. And that's where real closure begins. Not with a reveal, but with a reassessment. Reassessing how we engage with stories about real people. Reassessing what we reward with attention. Reassessing the difference between skepticism and suspicion. Because skepticism asks for evidence. Suspicion assumes deception. And this story has lived almost entirely in suspicion. So now, standing at the end of this long examination, there's one last thing to confront. Silence. Not the silence of cover-up. The silence of certainty. People who know something is settled don't keep debating it. They move on. And Prince Harry has moved on. He has built a life. A family. An identity that exists outside the rumor. The internet just hasn't caught up. Because moving on doesn't generate clicks. But you can. You can decide that this story has said everything it has to say. That repeating it doesn't reveal truth, it only recycles doubt. That the most radical thing in a culture addicted to outrage is to refuse to participate. And that refusal doesn't require agreement. It requires discernment. It requires recognizing when a question has been asked not to learn, but to provoke. And once you recognize that, the spell breaks. The rumor loses its grip. Not because it was disproven again, but because it was finally understood. And understanding is the one thing misinformation cannot survive. So if you're still waiting for a final twist, a shocking reveal, a moment that ties everything up neatly, here's the truth. The ending was never going to be dramatic. It was always going to be quiet. It was always going to be the moment you realize that the story doesn't deserve any more of your attention. That sometimes, the most powerful response to a rumor is not outrage, not debate, not even rebuttal. It's indifference. Because indifference starves what attention feeds. And when attention goes elsewhere, the loop ends. Not with a bang, but with a choice. And that choice, more than any DNA test or headline, is what finally decides how this story ends. If this story were a courtroom case, this would be the moment the room goes quiet. Not because a shocking piece of evidence just dropped, but because everyone suddenly realizes there is nothing left to argue. No new facts waiting backstage. No sealed envelope about to be opened. No DNA test hidden in a drawer somewhere. Just a long echo of repetition finally running out of sound. And that realization is deeply uncomfortable for a culture trained to expect spectacle. Because we've been conditioned to believe that truth arrives dramatically, that it explodes onto the screen with music and captions and a gasp-inducing twist. But real truth almost never does that. Real truth settles. It sits there, unchanged, while noise swirls around it. And this story is a perfect example. For decades, the facts have been stable, boring even, the kind of facts that don't trend. Dates, timelines, first-hand denials, basic biology, nothing flashy. So instead of engaging with those, the public conversation chased something more exciting. Suspicion. And suspicion doesn't want closure. It wants permission. Permission to keep asking. Permission to keep doubting. Permission to keep turning someone's life